Looking for a guaranteed way to create content that resonates with your audience? Start a podcast. Interview your ideal clients and let them choose the topic of the interview. Because if your ideal clients care about the topic, there's a good chance the rest of your audience will care about it too. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show. Welcome back to B2B Growth. I'm Logan Lyles with Sweetfish Media. I'm joined today by James Soto. He is the founder and CEO over at Industrial. James, welcome to the show, man. How's it going today?
Thanks for having me here, Logan.
Absolutely, man. So we're going to be talking about the primitive brain. We're going to get a little bit scientific. We might drop some dopamine, oxytocin, those sorts of things today in the conversation, and how we leverage those realities in marketing and how we face them and maybe where we're getting some things wrong. Before we jump into that topic though, man, James, give us a little bit of background on yourself and what you and the Industrial team are up to these days.
Hey, thanks. So Logan, I'm an industrial, born digital, born industrial, raised digital. I came up through the 90s as we're converting from analog to digital cellular networks, got recruited by the largest industrial directory, just as really Yahoo and Google were forming. And so as, let's say you think of the yellow page world going to digital, I was there for that process. And I actually did it not from the consumer side, but I was on the industrial side and how people changed and sourced and went digital. So a massive opportunity in the market, formed Industrial Strength Marketing, which now is 3 brands: Industrial, the agency, industrialmarketer.com, which is really our brand platform for creating a community of industrial marketers. And then there's just me. I'm out there to really help folks make marketing the strength of their business. And I do things like shows and speak and fun stuff like that because, we're a 30 plus person agency and the team wants me the heck out of the office. So
just talking real talk there, man. I love it. I think a good jumping off point for this conversation is talking a little bit about why our brains are wired for story as we get into this conversation about the primitive brain. What are some of the realities that sometimes we ignore as marketers, especially in B2B? Want to kick us off there, man?
Yeah, I think in the context, through the lens of marketing, is what I think I can help with here. And there's just some great references as well. So we all know and we hear a lot about breaking through the noise, and we have a deluge of content. And if you look at it, the scale at which we're producing content and we are just exposed, we're just checking out. It's oversaturation. And really, in essence, why it's important to understand the primitive brain in marketing is you have to understand how we work. And so in essence, what science is telling us is that story and the empathy it creates, in my opinion, and the science absolutely supports, story will save marketing. It will allow us to break through, and it will allow us to deliver engaging, useful, and contextually actionable experiences for people in a way that they really connect to and empathize with. So really what that means is that our brains are hardwired to dramatize, to imagine, and to be pulled into great stories. And I think, I've read some great books, The Storytelling Edge, and you'll get a lot of, cues from that here. Obviously, we hit YouTube and stuff like that to learn nowadays. But in essence, I think when you think about all the signals that we get, I think the best characterization I heard is that, when you're sitting down and you're listening to someone and they're telling you their story and it's emotional, it's just heartbreaking, or it's inspirational. And all of a sudden you're in a room full of people, and all of a sudden you just can't hear anybody else. And that's actually your primitive brain in action. Your reticular activating system, that part of the brain that really acts as a filter. And so that cocktail effect, that cocktail party effect, is that moment when you're, let's say, talking to a new friend or someone you may want to date, and all of a sudden someone says your name, boom, and you can hear that. Your brain's actually wired to get those interruption signals and to be brought in. But the whole point as marketers is we want to bring them into story, because that essentially, our brain lights up. If you look at, you actually look at studies of the brain, when you hear stories, our brains literally light up on scans. And what influences that is that the RAS, or reticular activating system, which one of the things that it does influence is the production of oxytocin, and oxytocin is the empathy drug. So when you're, I tell my story often, to my team about why our core values are what they are and what I believe. And, in essence, personally, is to make people better for having known and or work with you. And, as an agency, to better those that design, make, and move the world. I tell them about the story about when I was writing my business plan, because I was competing for a big segment of the business. And a lot of people were counting on me to have a job the next day if I won that segment of the business. I sat down at my parents' table. I was struggling. I had just had a daughter. She was colicky and I had to leave. I said, can I just come to your house and just write my business plan? And my father went out for a bike ride. My mom was working around the place. And I started on my business plan. And I got a knock on the door, and it was a police officer. And he told me my father was struck while cycling. And while I was fighting for my job, fighting for people to get, knowing if they're going to have a job, my father was there dying, and he ultimately succumbed and died in the hospital. That was day one of my business. And at that funeral, I heard, from a gentleman that drove, he worked within manufacturing for years. He drove, because I drove 8 hours here to tell you I sold to your dad. I didn't always get his business, but he was the best guy I ever met. I worked with him in and out of business for decades. And I came here to tell you that. Now, that told me that at the end of the day, it's not about what you do, but it's making people better for having known and or work with you. And that's the power of story. And that's what is true to me that influenced me. But it's also what, I understand that it's a very personal story. But did you get drawn in?
Absolutely, man. I mean, first, I have to just tip my cap to you, James. I appreciate the vulnerability and the willingness to share that story. Second of all, my condolences for your loss, even though it's a good time removed. And I know, we're not going down that trail, but your willingness to share that story with your team, share it with listeners here. I mean, so many listeners of this show have heard before, okay, you have to deploy empathy in your marketing. You have to make the customer the hero of the story that you tell. If they're like me and they listen to a lot of the content from Donald Miller and StoryBrand, but I can guarantee you other guests who have shared that same sort of good reminder will not remember it from those guests as much as they just heard it from you because of that story. I was reading a book just last night. I was picking up on chapter 3 of Captivate from Vanessa Van Edwards, who I heard on another one of the shows that we produce and got me digging into her book. And she mentioned that conversations and stories the same way, what we are drawn into are the highs and lows, those emotional valleys where we're feeling empathy or we're feeling excitement. Those are the memorable points. And if your marketing is just kind of coasting along in the middle and it feels like that kiddie ride of, I'm kind of telling you some things, right? But there are no highs and lows and those sorts of things. That dopamine of those highs, for instance, triggers us to remember them. And I think that's pretty applicable here to this conversation about the primitive brain, right?
Yeah. And so it's fascinating. And, I think, in telling your story, you have to be, authentic. Right. And let me tell you, I hate that word because everybody says it, you know what I mean? It becomes jargon. And I heard from someone where they said, it's like what your mom told you when you were a kid. It's like, hey, James, just be yourself. And so, when we talk about this, we talk about the brain, we talk about oxytocin and dopamine, and the other part of things that when you leave that tribe, that method of how we passed on information over the years through story, before we wrote, before hieroglyphs, before all of that, the other side of this, when you create that empathy, you create a tribe, you create trust and attention, and you become one. The empathy is not just, you got my attention, you got me with you. I am rooting for you to be the hero of this story. That's what it is. And if you are in that tribe, when you leave that tribe, like this is for real reasons, because you get, cortisol is a stressor. You get left behind by the pride. That lioness is stressed. Is stressed. So it's all about our innate survival instinct to be a community, to be a tribe, become part of our brand.
Hey everybody, we had to take just a minute today to tell you about our good friend Donald Kelly. If you're not aware, he's the host of the Sales Evangelist podcast. And for over 1,200 episodes, he's been interviewing the world's best sales experts, sellers, sales leaders, and entrepreneurs who share their strategies to succeed in sales. One of my favorite episodes on his podcast is episode 1204. Look for Impossible to Inevitable in the headline. If you're not yet subscribed, just search Sales Evangelist wherever you do your listening. All right, let's get back to the show.
Yeah, I like that you're bringing up the concept of the tribe as we talk about story, the role of empathy here. Before we hopped on, you were sharing with me some interesting things that jumped out to you from a recent Edelman study about where that next step of not just people deciding to give their attention, but then to give their trust. Speak a little bit on where the concept of the tribe and trust takes place, because I think everyone listening to this will recognize that getting some attention is only part of the battle. If you don't have trust and retain that attention, then it's really all for naught. So kind of what are those next steps? What jumped out to you in that study that you wanted to share with listeners today, man?
Yeah, I think there was two pieces. There was definitely an Edelman study, and they're a well-respected agency. They're really looking at, that notion of trust and authority, amongst other things. And also in just researching, doing things like podcasts and YouTube, and looking at, as we, in our capacity, my capacity as an industrial marketer in my agency, we're realizing that, like podcasts and videos are a hack. They're outperforming all other forms of content, like combined, in terms of, activating people, like they remember things more. And so what I saw a study that it was literally people trust an influencer over a brand. Why? Because of all their stories, all that empathy. And so the Edelman study really just, create just another data point that said, ultimately, what people trust are people just like me. And when we're trying to market to a CEO, maybe we need to start putting stories, literally people, case studies, but really authentically, not highly produced, but people just like me with their issues. And the second thing the study found is that, second to people just like me were experts, and that's company and industry experts. So it's no wonder why we are in the age of authority and the competition for attention, because we're seeking trust as an outcome as marketers. So there's no mystery why we're trying to create contextually engaging, useful, actionable, experiences, deliver value, but get real, even if it's having to take the risk and put yourself out there to even tell your story. And so that's, I think, what's really, really important. And I think the second thing that, we talked about before we started was, another study that went back years ago with the New York Times, and they looked at the homepage of the New York Times. People were figuring out why things are going viral or not. And what the study really showed is that, people really gravitate towards the extreme, something that makes them super mad, angry, feel super bad, They remember that. It goes viral often. Things that make you feel super happy or great or euphoric, that dopamine, right? Those things tend to go viral, and everything in between. The extremes are what you're remembered for as a brand. If we consider ourselves all as a brand, right? And everything in between is forgettable. They'll remember when you make them feel great, but when you make you feel bad. And so that's really the mandate we have as marketers and as a brand. And it comes all the way down to how we're wired.
Absolutely, man. There's a couple things I just wanted to kind of reiterate from what you said that I pulled out. The podcast episode I was mentioning on the customer experience podcast, we'll link to that episode in the show notes, where I heard Vanessa Van Edwards and got keyed into her book. They had done some research from her group, The Science of People, about the fact that oxytocin, which normally hits the brain when we shake hands, when we touch, right? It's that trust factor, that human connection. It can actually be triggered when we're looking into the eyes of someone else over video. And so just think about that in the power of video content that you're putting out from the people within your company so that they can make that human connection. Again, there's scientific evidence to this stuff. And also one of the stats that I throw out there a lot of times with marketers that I'm talking to about their podcast strategy, whether we're helping them or just giving them some pointers, is that people listen to typically 85% or more of every podcast episode that they start. And you think most podcast episodes are 20 to 30 minutes, unless it's Joe Rogan, it's way longer than that. But just try and think of any other medium where people are spending that much attention and hearing that voice and connecting the story. And obviously there's a great way to incorporate story, even in an interview-based show. We were talking as we were kind of mapping out our talking points framework here, even though it's an interview, for kind of the story arc. Let's talk about the why. Let's talk about empathy. Let's kind of bring it home with some resolution and some next steps in this conversation. And the other thing I think that is applicable for marketers in that like me effect, I saw some research from gong.io a while back talking about this huge pitfall for salespeople using the wrong sort of references, testimonials, and case studies. Because if you're selling to a 50-person company, maybe it's the same technology, maybe it's the same application, but you send them a case study for a Fortune 500 company, automatically, there's just no disconnect. It doesn't matter the value that you delivered and everything that they're raving about you, because those people aren't like them. And therefore, I think the lesson there for marketing and sales enablement and folks that are putting those sorts of case studies into their salespeople's hands is ask your sales team, where do we have some gaps? Where are you getting that, hey, I want some social proof, and we don't have any content ready to deliver that like me story to that potential buyer. What other advice do you want to leave with marketers today, either on that point or kind of rounding out this conversation around story, empathy, and building trust as a brand, James?
I think the transition to storytelling, it begins with questioning how we market. And I think the advice that I would give would be, if really consider doing things in the context, if they get what they want, some way or another, I'm going to get what I want. And I think that's, we hear, hey, value, 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 value. And that's great. And again, that will be jargon pretty soon. But I really think it's not just, hey, how do I do value? And I think you got to go next level. You really have to try to know someone is to love them. And I think you really have to go in with the heart, the heart of service. And I think if you have that heart, you can really question yourself. And I think ultimately that's what will break through. It's hard. It's hard, but I think that's it.
I couldn't agree more, James. Just from the moment we hopped on today, I could tell we were like-minded in so many ways. And you're reminding me of an episode we did a few weeks back with Kathleen Booth talking about, should we start ungating all of our content or a lot of it? And the thing that connects to our conversation today is it makes you think long and hard. Is this content really delivering value, or am I just trying to get that email address? Right? It isn't that what content marketing is supposed to be about, that we will attract people, we will gain their trust, and they will therefore give us their information, allow us to give them more, to speak to them more, to stay engaged with them, to be on their radar. But it's not just about, how can I trick them into giving us our email. I think that's one of the wrong turns we've taken. And you bring it home really well, thinking about, am I approaching this much like the true leadership is servanthood? True marketing should be servanthood with delivering value. How am I serving these folks? Because the more that I give, it is going to come around. And sometimes that takes a willingness to invest in the long game. And so we can have a whole conversation about how to do that, and then managing expectations and quarterly OKRs and all those sorts of things. But I've really enjoyed this conversation, James. If anybody listening to this wants to take a next step, ask some follow-up questions of you, or just stay connected, find some of the content that you guys are putting out. You mentioned doing some video or written content somewhere. Where can they find you? Where can they stay connected, man?
Yeah, so James Soto, SOTO on LinkedIn is a great place to find me. One of the things I've been doing and directing folks towards is a website we created called getmarketingready.com. And it's really, we do an assessment to really help folks honestly have a humble pie moment to really understand on dimensions of brand awareness. Are they actually able to articulate their true value? Do they actually know the key measures of success relates to marketing and performance? One of the things we're doing is we're realizing, we're even questioning, before we even get to trying to tell stories, are we ready for marketing? And are we really doing it in the right context? So that's one thing we're really geeking out about, that we're interested in getting feedback on. And we actually think we can actually productize it at some point, or turn it into actually a high value service for folks. So those are the things that we're up to. But yeah, I'd love to connect on LinkedIn, love to lift folks up, love to see their feeds and stories themselves. So let's keep seeing each other's stories. That'd be great.
Absolutely, man. On that note, I just have to say thank you again for sharing that personal story to not only make the point that you were making there, but I feel like, I know you better. Hopefully listeners do as well. So thank you for that. Thank you for the time today. Really appreciate you being on the show, James.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I hate it when podcasts incessantly ask their listeners for reviews, but I get why they do it, because reviews are enormously helpful when you're trying to grow a podcast audience. So here's what we decided to do. If you leave a review for B2B Growth in Apple Podcasts and email me a screenshot of the review to james@sweetfishmedia.com, I'll send you a signed copy of my new book, Content-Based Networking, How to Instantly Connect with Anyone You Want to Know. We get a review, you get a free book. We both win.